Thomas Carlyle was born in 1795 in Dumfriesshire in Scotland, and he went to the University of Edinburgh. He had some success early on doing translations into English of German literature, and at the time, German literature was not very well known in English, or at least the works that he was translating were not yet well known. So he had some success there, but he later had difficulty finding his footing in his career. But he went on to write a range of important work, including some very large historical works on the French Revolution, Frederick the Great, some on Oliver Cromwell, other topics. In addition to history and biographies, he wrote literary criticism. He wrote about politics, poetry, religion, and some other topics as well. In school, he excelled at math, and some sources will call him a mathematician. And he did develop something called a Carlyle circle, which is a quadratic equation that graphs as a circle, and its solutions are the points at which the circle crosses the x-axis. And he also translated The Elements of Geometry by Adrien Marie Legendre from French to English, which I haven't looked at that specifically, but to translate something you have to have a pretty strong grasp of what the person is talking about. So depending on how high of a geometry text that is, that might also give us some indication of his level in mathematics. But beyond that, I couldn't find a lot of detail about what he did in math. So he was certainly interested in math, at least earlier in his life, and had a capacity for it, but it's harder to see the details of what he did than to find information about his literary work. And in 1881, Thomas Carlyle died in London at the age of 85. It's difficult to pin down his philosophy because, for example, he believed in belief, but he wasn't obviously attached to one religion, though he struggled with faith and non-faith, unbelief, during his life. And he'll sometimes be moralizing, but then he'll write a line that opposes at least a conventional morality. Not the way that Nietzsche does, or at least not in the text that I read, but for example, he will speak disparagingly of ballot boxes. And at the time that he was writing, voting, democracy, universal suffrage, or even the ideal of universal suffrage were relatively new. He's writing basically in the early 19th century. And so it's easier to oppose that. Whereas now, if you write that you think democracy is bad or it's a bad system, that's really a political position, but it's taken on the weight of being a moral position. It almost seems immoral to oppose democracy. And I read a quote about Thomas Carlyle sometime in the last few years, and I thought it was Emerson. But then I went back, I pulled up a digital file of Emerson essays, and I was searching for Carlyle, and I couldn't find it. So now I don't remember where I saw it. But Carlyle and Emerson were good friends. Carlyle wrote some very nice things about Emerson. At one point, I don't remember the exact quote, but he says something about Emerson. He doesn't really rip into him, but he kind of says he's a little too ethereal. I need things to be a little bit more solid. And I personally think that's a fair criticism of Emerson. You can check out the episode about some of Emerson's essays on this podcast if you want to hear more about that. But it's also easy to see why the two men were friends. They were writing very similar things, though also, to be fair, Carlyle spoke other languages. He spoke at least French and German. I think he also spoke some Latin, Spanish, and Italian, though I'm not as sure about that. And Emerson, like a good American, I think spoke nothing but English, though his writing has some Latin tags in it. Carlyle also, he did this math work. He wrote some pretty serious history, whereas Emerson really just wrote essays during his whole life, which maybe that's fine. That's what he wanted to focus on. But Carlyle and Emerson, in their essays, it's easy to see how these guys would get along. They both were writing sort of semi-spiritually, trying to get at what's going on or what might be going on or what we could imagine is going on below the surface of things. And this is a difficult kind of writing to deal with because on the one hand, there isn't any way to prove any of this or to demonstrate it. You can kind of look at it and see if you think it makes sense or see if it sounds right. But it's sort of hard to pin down. I often find it's good to open this podcast with some historical context about the guy whose writing we're going to be looking at, especially when that context is particularly complicated. There's wars and factions and fighting going on and some kind of cultural development. And Carlyle, if you look at the biography of his life, it's not really punctuated by these large intrusions of world politics or major life events. But he was writing during the 19th century. He published the text we're going to be looking at today, which is On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History in 1841. So that's middle 19th century, which of course was a period of a lot of change. One of the major things that was going on was urbanization from the beginning to the end of the century, from 1800 to 1900. In 1800, less than 3% of the world's population lived in urban areas, and by 1920, the number had risen to 14%. So that's a little bit after the end of the 19th century, but you can still see the trend there. Democracy obviously was something that was spreading a lot, and all of the social and political change that comes from democracy, the cultural change. So it's hard to place Carlyle's writing exactly, but you can see that he's, at least in that context, there's a little bit of a reaction to that. But maybe also it's a little difficult to pin him to a particular political context because he was trying to write about what he thought was universal. He sometimes will talk a little bit specifically or locally, but not very. At least in the text we're going to be looking at today, he doesn't talk about contemporary politicians or anything like that. He's trying to talk about the universe, which is something that he and Emerson have in common, as I said. But in the case of Carlyle, it's fine if we get right into it. Carlyle writes, quote, "Universal history, the history of what man has accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of the great men who have worked here. They were the leaders of men, these great ones, the modelers, patterns, and in a wide sense creators of whatsoever the general mass of men contrive to do or to attain. All things that we see standing accomplished in the world are properly the outer material result, the practical realization and embodiment of thoughts that dwelt in the great men sent into the world. The soul of the whole world's history, it may justly be considered, were the history of these." End quote. So these lectures, and I don't think that I mentioned that this book is the notes from a set of lectures that Carlyle gave, but these lectures or this book are generally pointed to as the origin of this notion of the great man theory of history. That is, this idea that Carlyle just articulated, that history is largely determined by big individuals, by individual leaders or inventors or artists, and that everyone else follows after them. And the competing position with this is this idea that history is determined by large social movements, that first the mass of people decide that something is going in a certain direction, and then a leader appears who can reflect that energy. It's not him that's doing it. It looks like that it's him that's doing it. It's really all these other people have all this energy. And he ends up becoming a figurehead for that social energy that's perhaps harder to see or to articulate than is the figure of a single person and the narrative that this one person is making something happen. And this is a big question that would need a lot of thought, and Carlyle apparently has given it a lot of thought. But to answer it for ourselves, we'd have to look at a lot of different examples. But one thing that comes to my mind is, while there are events like, for instance, the American Revolution, that are often explained as being a lot of discontent among a lot of people, both at the popular level and at the elite level, and that Washington was really channeling that energy, and he led it and funded it and did these different things. You have to also remember how many times there has been a popular movement, a peasants' revolt in whatever shape it might be, that completely failed, or maybe it was somehow effectively channeled against its own wishes. It was sort of tricked and dissolved in one way or another. And how you can imagine that that revolt, or whatever it was, might have gone differently if there had been effective leadership. Because that's a case where there is a popular will to make something happen. The competing theory to that of the great man theory is, again, this idea that big masses of people want something to happen, and then it happens, or it can. And you can see in history many examples of a time when a lot of people wanted something to happen, and it didn't, and that was in part because of a lack of effective leadership. And maybe you could argue that that is not the result of a lack of effective leadership. It's rather a problem of quantity, of force, that if a group of people wants something to happen, it has to be sufficient to overrun whatever's opposing it. And that then becomes a kind of social arithmetic question in which you have to look at each case to see how many people were opposing this thing, how many people were supporting it, etc. But that, I think, is why then historians like to look at great leaders and to try to see the decisions they made, because sometimes you do look at a great leader, somebody who's called a great leader, and you do see exceptional decision-making or a moment of insight. But then you get into the problem of what's called survivor bias, that if you have 1,000 revolts or political projects or battles or wars or whatever it might be, there are going to be some people every once in a while for whom they get lucky many times. That is, you're often faced with kind of a coin flip decision and you just have to pick one. Should I prepare for this contingency or that one? Should I expect that the enemy or my political opponent is going to be doing this or that? And you just have to guess if you don't have good enough information. And for the people in history that we don't hear about, they guessed wrong, or they guessed wrong on the third such instance of that happening. They guessed right on the first two, and then on the third one they got it wrong. And it's not quite that simple of a coin flip, but they made moves that retroactively look brilliant because it turned out that it was exactly what they needed to do, except that on the third time that that came up, they messed up because they made a decision based on the similar amount of information and it was wrong. And then their whole thing fell apart or whatever it might be. But then you could imagine that if you run that simulation enough times, and you could argue that history is, among other things, a place where that simulation is run over and over again, you would get people every once in a while who they guess right on the coin flip 12 times in a row, which is statistically very unlikely. But if you do it enough times, it could happen. And if it happens under the right circumstances, then it becomes what you call maybe the French Revolution. But I don't think you could simplify it that much either, that the people who we call great leaders are just the winners in those kinds of chance games, because some of them, when you study them, they do seem to have some unusual insight. But it's hard to tease that out from what you want the story to be. Anyway, the great man theory of history is not very fashionable these days. It's much more fashionable to think about history as democratic, as being at the whims of the people, doing what the people wants it to do. And certainly a great leader never does anything alone. And he also can't make a bunch of people think how he wants them to think. But it's at the very least a give and take, where there is some kind of popular will, but they don't know what to do or they don't know how to channel it. And then there's a figure who's able to do something with that energy. Carlyle writes, quote, "It is well said, in every sense, that a man's religion is the chief fact with regard to him, a man's or a nation of men's. By religion I do not mean here the church creed which he professes, the articles of faith which he will sign, and in words or otherwise assert, not this wholly, in many cases not this at all. Skipping ahead, but the thing a man does practically believe, and this is often enough without asserting it even to himself, much less to others, the thing a man does practically lay to heart, and know for certain, concerning his vital relations to this mysterious universe, and his duty and destiny there, that is in all cases the primary thing for him, and creatively determines all the rest. That is his religion, or it may be his mere skepticism and no religion. The manner it is in which he feels himself to be spiritually related to the unseen world or no world. And I say, if you tell me what that is, you tell me to a very great extent what the man is, and what the kind of things he will do is." End quote. So he's saying if you know a man's religion, if you know what he believes, and he specifically says he's not only talking about what goes on in a church, but if you know what his ideas are, what his belief is, and it might even be a belief that he hasn't articulated even to himself, much less to other people, then you'll know to a great extent what kind of things he can do and what sort of man he is. And that's certainly true. And later on in the same passage talking about men and nations, he says, quote, "The thoughts they had were the parents of the actions they did. Their feelings were parents of their thoughts. It was the unseen and spiritual in them that determined the outward and actual. Their religion, as I say, was the great fact about them." End quote. And he goes back even a step further than that kind of explanation is typically brought in a modern conversation, which is, we would say certainly your thoughts determine your actions, but then he says your feelings determine your thoughts, that there's something sort of behind your thoughts, a general, I don't know, an atmosphere or something, and that's what your thoughts come out of. So you think of your thoughts as this totally free thing, and that your actions are subject to your thoughts, but your thoughts are more or less autonomous. But he's sort of saying here that your thoughts also are subject to this other thing behind them, and he might say that that's your sort of unspoken religion. And as a brief summary, he has 6 lectures in this book, and they talk about the hero as different parts of society, and then gives examples from each one. So he talks about the hero as divinity, as prophet, as poet, as priest, as man of letters, and as king. And then he gives a range of examples for each one of these. He talks about paganism, he talks about Muhammad and Islam, he talks about Dante and Shakespeare, he talks about Martin Luther and John Knox. John Knox is the guy who brought the Reformation to Scotland and is thought of as one of the founders of Presbyterianism alongside John Calvin. He talks about Samuel Johnson, Robert Burns, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and then under the heading of kings, he talks about Oliver Cromwell and Napoleon. And we're not going to have time to talk about all of those examples, but we can look at some of it. Some of these first passages are about his discussion of paganism and Norse mythology and Scandinavia. He writes, quote, "That men should have worshipped their fellow man as a god, and not him only, but stocks and stones, and all manner of animate and inanimate objects, and fashioned for themselves such a distracted chaos of hallucinations by way of theory of the universe. All this looks like an incredible fable. Nevertheless, it is a clear fact that they did it. Such hideous, inextricable jungle of misworships, misbeliefs, men, made as we are, did actually hold by and live at home in. This is strange. Yes, we may pause in sorrow and silence over the depths of darkness that are in man, if we rejoice in the heights of purer vision he has attained to. Such things were and are in man, in all men, in us too." End quote. He's reflecting on how strange the pagan religion is, and how strange it is that men would worship each other and worship rocks and do all these strange things and live by them. But he says that just as we imagine these heights are in us, that the potential for greatness in man is in everyone, so is the potential for this kind of swamp that you could get totally misguided and end up somewhere that it's not worth being. Later, he's talking about Tibet and what we would today call the Dalai Lama. He writes, quote, "They have their belief, these poor Tibet people, that Providence sends down always an incarnation of himself into every generation. At bottom, some belief in a kind of pope. At bottom, still better, belief that there is a greatest man, that he is discoverable, that once discovered, we ought to treat him with an obedience which knows no bounds. This is the truth of Grand Lamaism. The discoverability is the only error here. The Tibet priests have methods of their own of discovering what man is greatest, fit to be supreme over them. Bad methods, but are they so much worse than our methods of understanding him to be always the eldest born of a certain genealogy? Alas, it is a difficult thing to find good methods for." End quote. And this is one of the essential problems of government, is trying to figure out who we should listen to, or who should govern. And here, Carlyle is giving the example of the Dalai Lama as an example of a system of trying to do that. And that system, because we don't live in it, looks kind of provincial. It looks very local, and it comes out of some tradition that I don't know how they determine who the Dalai Lama is, but they do it in a certain way, and then that guy becomes the leader, essentially. And Carlyle points out that we aren't exempt from having such a process. I mean, in his time, he talks about always being the eldest born of a certain genealogy, which that's hereditary rule. But he also later talks about ballot boxes. Our modern method has more to do with ballot boxes, which has its own flaws. But at base, what we're trying to do is figure out who should get to make the difficult decisions that affect everybody, or who should have a lot more influence in them. Since, of course, the American president by himself doesn't just get to decide what happens. Later, he is talking about the Old Norse man's relationship to nature, and he writes, quote, "Nature was to this man what to the thinker and prophet it forever is, preternatural. This green, flowery, rock-built earth, the trees, the mountains, rivers, many sounding seas, that great deep sea of azure that swims overhead, the wind sweeping through it, the black cloud fashioning itself together, now pouring out fire, now hail and rain. What is it? Aye, what? At bottom, we do not yet know. We can never know at all. It is not by our superior insight that we escape the difficulty. It is by our superior levity, our inattention, our want of insight. It is by not thinking that we cease to wonder at it. Hardened round us, encasing wholly every notion we form, is a wrappage of traditions, hearsays, mere words. We call that fire of the black thundercloud electricity, and lecture learnedly about it, and grind the like of it out of glass and silk. But what is it? What made it? Whence comes it? Whither goes it? Science has done much for us, but it is a poor science that would hide from us the great, deep, sacred infinitude of nescience, whither we can never penetrate, on which all science swims as a mere superficial film. This world, after all our science and sciences, is still a miracle, wonderful, inscrutable, magical, and more, to whosoever will think of it." End quote. Carlyle is arguing that people of the past, and particularly the Old Norse peoples, wondered at nature, wondered what it was, in a way that science has made us stop doing, because we can sort of halfway pretend that we understand it. Because hardened around us, encasing wholly every notion we form, is a wrappage of traditions, hearsays, mere words. So we too have a kind of tradition about how we talk about nature, but that doesn't change the fundamental mystery of it. We can manipulate electricity, but what is it? Okay, a physicist can describe it in more detail, but how did it come to be that way? And he uses this great word, nescience, Nescience, which if you look it up, it just says it's a lack of knowledge or awareness or an ignorance. But it might be better to describe it as anti-knowledge. That is, knowledge being all of the things that we know or that you know, and nescience being everything that you don't know, meaning all the distance between your knowledge and an omniscient, perfect understanding of everything in the universe. And he writes, "Science has done much for us, but it is a poor science that would hide from us the great, deep, sacred infinitude of nescience, whither we can never penetrate, on which all science swims as a mere superficial film." So there's a lot of skepticism in that passage, both on the limits of what existing science tells us, that even what we know doesn't explain very much. But then, beyond what we know, there's far more that we don't know and perhaps will never know. And this is a very skeptical thought. Carlyle writes, quote, "To these primeval men, all things and everything they saw exist beside them were an emblem of the godlike of some god. And look what perennial fiber of truth was in that. To us also, through every star, through every blade of grass, is not a God made visible, if we will open our minds and eyes. We do not worship in that way now, but is it not reckoned still a merit, proof of what we call a poetic nature, that we recognize how every object has a divine beauty in it, how every object still verily is a window through which we may look into infinitude itself?" End quote. He's pointing out how in the pagan religion, everything around the believer in a pagan religion was somehow connected to one god or another, a tree, a river, the sky, etc. And we don't believe that anymore, but we value it if somebody can look at an ordinary object and see the divine in it. That is, see the infinite in it. If you just look at a cup sitting on a table in the right way, you can almost see past it into something else. And maybe we're just imagining things when we do that. But I think many people have had some kind of experience like that. Not a major spiritual experience when you're looking at an object, but just the sense of accessing something else behind it. And I don't think he's taking this as a proof of the pagan religion, but just as a possible explanation for how those kinds of beliefs came about. That if you can do this with an ordinary object, it's only the easier to do it with the sky or a river or a tree. And then over time, a religion could grow out of that. He writes, quote, "And now if worship even of a star had some meaning in it, how much more might that of a hero? Worship of a hero is transcendent admiration of a great man. I say great men are still admirable. I say there is at bottom nothing else admirable. No nobler feeling than this of admiration for one higher than himself dwells in the breast of man. It is to this hour, and at all hours, the vivifying influence in man's life. Religion, I find, stand upon it. Not paganism only, but far higher and truer religions. All religion hitherto known." End quote. And this discussion of hero worship is one of the central points in this book. It's in the title, after all. And when we hear the phrase hero worship, it has sort of a pejorative connotation, or some people use it that way. But Carlyle clearly thought that this admiration of people that you perceive to be better than you in some way was a great thing. And I don't think that he would say that admiring people who are richer than you because of their wealth was a great thing. I don't think that's what he's talking about. But admiring somebody, especially from history, who is stronger, smarter, braver, more capable, he views this as a very positive thing. And we'll see some other discussion of this. He writes, quote, "Or coming into lower, less unspeakable provinces, is not all loyalty akin to religious faith also? Faith is loyalty to some inspired teacher, some spiritual hero. And what, therefore, is loyalty proper? The life breath of all society, but an effluence of hero worship, submissive admiration for the truly great. Society is founded on hero worship. All dignities of rank on which human association rests are what we may call a hieroarchy, government of heroes, or a hierarchy, for it is sacred enough withal. The duke means dux, leader. King is conning, canning, man that knows or cans." End quote. So the king, the conning or the canning, is the one who can do it, the capable one, or the one who knows. And here Carlyle is arguing that, in fact, all society is built on hero worship. In the case of Christian society, it's connected to Jesus. In the case of Islamic society, it's connected to Muhammad. And of course, the adherents of this religion would say we worship God, not these men. And I think Carlyle would point out that the religion came from these men and from their model of living. And the followers believe them to be the perfect men who are worth following. So this is a kind of hero worship. He writes, quote, "If we will think of it, no time need have gone to ruin. Could it have found a man great enough, a man wise and good enough, wisdom to discern what the time wanted, valor to lead it on the right road thither. These are the salvation of any time. But I liken common languid times with their unbelief, distress, perplexity, with their languid doubting characters and embarrassed circumstances, impotently crumbling down into ever worse distress towards final ruin. All this I liken to dry, dead fuel, waiting for the lightning out of heaven that shall kindle it. The great man, with his free force direct out of God's own hand, is the lightning. His word is the wise, healing word which all can believe in. All blazes round him now when he has once struck on it into fire like his own. The dry, mouldering sticks are thought to have called him forth. They did want him greatly. But as to calling him forth, those are critics of small vision, I think, who cry, 'See, is it not the sticks that made the fire?' No sadder proof can be given by a man of his own littleness than disbelief in great men. There is no sadder symptom of a generation than such general blindness to the spiritual lightning, with faith only in the heap of barren dead fuel. It is the last consummation of unbelief. In all epochs of the world's history, we shall find the great man to have been the indispensable savior of his epoch, the lightning without which the fuel never would have burnt. The history of the world, I said already, was the biography of great men. Such small critics do what they can to promote unbelief and universal spiritual paralysis, but happily they cannot always completely succeed. In all times it is possible for a man to arise great enough to feel that they and their doctrines are chimeras and cobwebs." End quote. He explains much more succinctly and vividly this issue that I was trying to talk about before by giving the metaphor of a bunch of dry sticks all gathered together, and the great man being the lightning that lights them on fire, of course in a good way, that activates them in a certain way. And he says the critic says, well, the sticks are what started the fire. And of course, the sticks could never have caught fire without the lightning. Though, maybe also at the same time, lightning often strikes a place and doesn't start a fire. So, there is a balance there. But without the leader, the situation won't become activated, according to Carlyle. He writes, quote, "Does not every true man feel that he is himself made higher by doing reverence to what is really above him? No nobler or more blessed feeling dwells in man's heart. And to me, it is very cheering to consider that no skeptical logic, or general triviality, insincerity, and aridity of any time and its influences can destroy this noble inborn loyalty and worship that is in man. In times of unbelief, which soon have to become times of revolution, much down-rushing, sorrowful decay and ruin is visible to everybody. For myself in these days, I seem to see in this indestructibility of hero worship the everlasting, adamant lower than which the confused wreck of revolutionary things cannot fall. The confused wreck of things crumbling and even crashing and tumbling all around us in these revolutionary ages will get down so far, no farther. It is an eternal cornerstone from which they can begin to build themselves up again. That man, in some sense or other, worships heroes, that we all of us reverence and must ever reverence great men. This is, to me, the living rock amid all rushings down whatsoever, the one fixed point in modern revolutionary history, otherwise as if bottomless and shoreless." End quote. I find that there's a lot in modern life that encourages us to go downward. That is, to prefer what is ordinary and mediocre. And in my life, I don't always know what I think is right or correct, but I'm always trying to go up somehow. I'm trying to figure out which way is up and to go up. And the simple ways of doing this are with daily discipline in what you do, in learning and reading and exercising and trying to eat healthy and these different things. And though the phrase hero worship has something in it that's a little bit strong, I wouldn't like to feel that I worship great figures from history. That seems a little bit strange somehow. But I certainly admire them. And I think admiring people whom you perceive to be great helps this effort in going up. If nothing else, it sometimes can show the way. It can be a compass. This notion of higher, of excelsior, is kind of abstract, and it's sometimes hard to tell which way to go. And even if you have an example from history, you don't necessarily know that that is a good example to emulate. But you at least can look at them and say, is that a good way to be? You can see a human manifestation of some ideal, or a person who has gotten closer to that ideal than people tend to do. And that illustration can help you to think about it. Is that something good? Is that something I want to emulate? Is that something that's good for the community? And I think part of the philosophical and spiritual crisis that we're in the 21st century has to do with people who want to go up, who have a natural impulse to try to go up. Even if we're not very good at it, even if we fail, it's like we're climbing a mountain, and we're willing to make ourselves tired just getting up one rock at a time. Even if we don't get very far in the end, that seems like a worthwhile thing to do, because if enough of us are working on that, the society as a whole will be elevated, and that will be a good thing in the long term. There are many people who have this natural impulse, and maybe almost everybody does, but the modern world in a lot of ways discourages you from doing that. Or it says to do that is somehow improper, or that you should try to excel only in ways that benefit the global economy, either in your career so that you can get better at making money for somebody else, or so that you can earn money and be a better consumer. You can be the best consumer. You bought all the things, or you bought the most expensive thing that very few people can buy. You didn't make the art that very few people could make, but you bought the thing that very few people could buy. Good for you. That's the kind of striving that's rewarded, that's encouraged. But there's a much wider field of things that you can strive for. And I think part of the nihilism, I think there's a lot of sources for it, but one part of it is that this very basic human impulse is not nurtured and encouraged. This impulse to be higher in other ways, spiritually, though not necessarily religiously or philosophically. If you're somebody who has mastered your appetites, it's very hard to get you to order GrubHub. If you're somebody who's content with very little, it's very hard to get you to buy digital products that help to distract you. So in fact, this kind of spiritual elevation, not only is it sometimes neutral beside the interest of the global economy, it sometimes goes against them. So if there's to be any encouragement on this subject, it would actually be in the other direction. Though this might not be conscious encouragement, GrubHub probably would never try to make people fat and try to make people have low willpower. I'm married, so I never use GrubHub, but I know people who do. But if the collective interest of many different organizations is going toward people having less self-control, then whether they're doing it consciously or not, that is going to be an effort that they will support when they can. And it might be as simple as not valuing or even mocking a more ascetic lifestyle in your private life. If you imagine that an architect, and this is just an example, I don't think that architects are really part of what I'm talking about, though they might be to a lesser extent. If an architect were to meet somebody who says, oh yeah, I just live nomadically in a tent. I just like wander around the country with my backpack and my tent, and I trespass on people's land, or I try to find public land and I camp out there and then I move somewhere else for a while. The architect would disapprove of that lifestyle, at least internally. They'd say, oh, that's weird. And they might even say to that person, oh, don't you know how nice it is to have a house? You should try to get a house. Houses are great. And in the same way, if you have a product that depends on people's lack of self-control and a lack, for example, of a stable family life so that you can get groceries and have nice meals at home that are cheaper and more healthy and more delicious, when you encounter that in your social life, you would have a natural hostility to it, whether you're aware of it or not, I think. A short line in getting into the passages about paganism is, he writes, quote, "Let us forget that it is erroneous religion. Let us look at it as old thought and try if we cannot sympathize with it somewhat," end quote. And that's a useful way to look at a range of old subjects that might seem very alien. If you look at Greek mythology or something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's easy to look at it and say, well, obviously there's not a god of this or that. And if there were, he probably wouldn't fight with this other god. So what is this? But if you think of it as old thought, as reflecting the way that people thought a long time ago, it becomes much more useful. In a certain way, it might be thought of as the aggregation, maybe, of the thought of many people over a long period of time. We have very few documents from the peoples who believed in what we today call Norse mythology. But we have pieces of the mythology, and from that we can learn something about the people. And that's what Carlyle is talking about here. He writes, quote, "All Scandinavian thinkers, since the first of them, contributed to that Scandinavian system of thought in ever new elaboration and addition. It is the combined work of them all. What history it had, how it changed from shape to shape, by one thinker's contribution after another, till it got to the full final shape we see it under in the Edda, no man will now ever know. Its councils of Trebizond, councils of Trent, Athanasius's, Dante's, Luther's, are sunk without echo in the dark night. Only that it had such a history we can all know," end quote. He references a number of things there. He talks about the Edda, which refers to both the poetic and the prose Edda, which are Icelandic documents from the 13th century that are extant sources on Norse mythology. And then, of course, he mentions a number of things from Christian history, both events and figures that shaped what Christianity would eventually become. And he's saying that we don't know any of the history of how Norse mythology came into its final shape. We don't know any of the figures, we don't know any of the events, the meetings, the discussions. All we can know or guess is that such events took place and such people existed, but all record of them, unfortunately, has been lost. He writes, quote, "Among those shadowy Edda matters, amid all that fantastic congeries of assertions and traditions, in their musical mythologies, the main practical belief a man could have was probably not much more than this, of the Valkyrs and the Hall of Odin, of an inflexible destiny, and that the one thing needful for a man was to be brave. The Valkyrs are the choosers of the slain, a destiny inexorable, which it is useless trying to bend or soften, has appointed who is to be slain. This was a fundamental point for the Norse believer, as indeed it is for all earnest men everywhere, for a Muhammad, a Luther, for a Napoleon too. Lies at the basis this for every such man. It is the woof out of which his whole system of thought is woven. The Valkyrs, and then that these choosers lead the brave to a heavenly hall of Odin, only the base and slavish being thrust elsewhither, into the helms of Hela, the death goddess. I take this to have been the soul of the whole Norse belief. They understood in their heart that it was indispensable to be brave, that Odin would have no favor for them, but despise and thrust them out, if they were not brave. Consider too whether there is not something in this. It is an everlasting duty, valid in our day as in that, the duty of being brave. Valor is still value. The first duty for a man is still something of subduing fear. We must get rid of fear. We cannot act at all till then. A man's acts are slavish, not true but specious. His very thoughts are false. He thinks, too, as a slave and coward, till he have got fear under his feet. Odin's creed, if we disentangle the real kernel of it, is true to this hour. A man shall and must be valiant. He must march forward and quit himself like a man, trusting imperturbably in the appointment and choice of the upper powers, and, on the whole, not fear at all. Now and always, the completeness of his victory over fear will determine how much of a man he is." End quote. Bravery is not a subject that comes up a lot in modern life. It seems somehow old-fashioned or something, like it's not necessary anymore because now we have Amazon. It's possible that we need bravery now more than we used to, not less. Carlyle writes, quote, "Nor was it altogether nothing, even that wild sea roving and battling through so many generations. It needed to be ascertained which was the strongest kind of men, who were to be ruler over whom. Among the Northland sovereigns, too, I find some who got the title woodcutter, forest-felling kings. Much lies in that. I suppose at bottom many of them were forest-fellers as well as fighters, though the skalds talk mainly of the latter, misleading certain critics not a little, for no nation of men could ever live by fighting alone. There could not produce enough come out of that. I suppose the right good fighter was oftenest also the right good forest-feller, the right good improver, discerner, doer, and worker in every kind. For true valor, different enough from ferocity, is the basis of all. A more legitimate kind of valor that, showing itself against the untamed forests and dark brute powers of nature, to conquer nature for us. In the same direction have not we, their descendants, since carried it far? May such valor last forever with us." End quote. It's possible that now we've gone a little too far in this direction of subjugating nature, because now we're pretty effectively destroying the natural environment that we depend on. But reading Carlyle, we can get a glimpse of where that comes from, that there was a long period where, far from being occasionally able to manipulate it in a certain way on a relatively large scale, we were completely at the mercy of nature. And the man or men who could subjugate nature were also considered valorous, because this was a significant and necessary thing. Here's a short passage, quote, "They seem to have seen, these brave old Northmen, what meditation has taught all men in all ages, that this world is after all but a show, a phenomenon or appearance, no real thing. All deep souls see into that. The Hindu mythologist, the German philosopher, the Shakespeare, the earnest thinker, wherever he may be. We are such stuff as dreams are made of." End quote. And of course that last line is from The Tempest. And then he says something about the value of knowing a bit about what we call Norse mythology or the Norse religion. Quote, "That Norse religion, a rude but earnest, sternly impressive consecration of valor, so we may define it, sufficed for these old valiant Northmen. Consecration of valor is not a bad thing. We will take it for good, so far as it goes. Neither is there no use in knowing something about this old paganism of our fathers. Unconsciously, and combined with higher things, it is in us yet, that old faith withal. To know it consciously brings us into closer and clearer relation with the past, with our own possessions in the past. For the whole past, as I keep repeating, is the true possession of the present. The past had always something true, and is a precious possession. In a different time, in a different place, it is always some other side of our common human nature that has been developing itself. The actual true is the sum of all these. Not any one of them by itself constitutes what of human nature is hitherto developed." End quote. So we tend not to think of Norse paganism as being part of our history, but Carlyle argues that it is, and it's still in us even, just because it is part of that history. And if you think of King Olaf, who Carlyle mentions elsewhere, being the Norse king who brought Christianity to the pagans that were under him, or if you think of St. Patrick, who brought Christianity to the Irish in the 5th century, or to the people of the land we would today call Ireland, and Vladimir I, who brought it to the Russians also in the 10th century. The Anglo-Saxons and the Franks, I think, got it earlier, more like the Irish around the 5th century. But the point is, it was in that range of about 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, depending on what part of Europe you're talking about. And while we might imagine that the Norse past, the period during which people believed in what we call Norse mythology, this paganism, European paganism, was much older than that. It's in some dim, misty part of history that we can't access. It was basically contemporary with the Roman Empire, and later it succeeded the Western Roman Empire. It existed after it, and it also existed at the same time as ancient Greece, going back to, if you talk about Homer, 700 BC roughly. And probably even before that, we don't know how old it was. The reason why it seems distant, I think there are at least two reasons, is not because of it is especially old. It isn't. It's as old as the Western Roman Empire and ancient Greece, and even younger than that. But there's two things. One is that unfortunately there aren't very many records. One thing that the Norse did not do very well, though it seems like they did many other things very well, is write things down, unfortunately. So we don't have as much access to their life as we do to the Greeks and to the Romans, who wrote down many things. And that might actually lead to the second reason, which is that the historiography of Europe generally moves from ancient Greece to ancient Rome to the story of Christianity, roughly. And that might partially be because of the lack of documents from the Norse, but it also might be because ancient Greece was mostly before Christianity, so they're sort of off the hook, and the Romans eventually converted to Christianity, so maybe they got a little bit of a part in when the Christian monks were writing the histories later. But anyway, it being hard to study doesn't make it any less of a part of the history. It just means that it takes more work to understand it. And indeed, if you read the Poetic Edda, it is pretty hard to understand. It jumps around a lot. It's pieces of stories. It's not terribly linear. But fortunately, other people have been doing lots of historical and archaeological work to try to understand those peoples better. So there's lots of other good secondary resources on them. Carlyle writes, quote, "Every new opinion, at its starting, is precisely in a minority of one. In one man's head alone there it dwells as yet. One man alone of the whole world believes it. There is one man against all men. That he take a sword and try to propagate with that will do little for him. You must first get your sword. On the whole, a thing will propagate itself as it can. We do not find of the Christian religion either, that it always disdained the sword, when once it had got one. Charlemagne's conversion of the Saxons was not by preaching. I care little about the sword. I will allow a thing to struggle for itself in this world, with any sword or tongue or implement it has, or can lay hold of. We will let it preach, and pamphleteer, and fight, and to the uttermost bestir itself, and do, beak and claws, whatsoever is in it, very sure that it will, in the long run, conquer nothing which does not deserve to be conquered. What is better than itself, it cannot put away, but only what is worse. In this great duel, nature herself is umpire, and can do no wrong. The thing which is deepest rooted in nature, what we call truest, that thing and not the other will be found growing at last." End quote. That's kind of a difficult passage, because on the one hand it's a little bit fatalistic, that whoever should win out in the end will, and it's a little bit survival of the fittest, or might makes right. I think it's possible to imagine that a doctrine or a belief could win out, not exactly because it's true, but because of some other aspect of the politics at that time. But perhaps Carlyle is talking about something broader. He's not talking about something being true in the sense that it lines up with a human system of reason and logic, but if it is the idea that spreads across the world, then it is by definition true because of its spreadability, because of the extent to which it can spread itself. If that's what he's arguing, that's a different idea of truth, and he doesn't go into what he means in more detail than that. But it's an interesting thought. He writes, quote, "The poor swearing soldier, hired to be shot, has his honor of a soldier, different from drill regulations and the shilling a day. It is not to taste sweet things, but to do noble and true things, and vindicate himself under God's heaven as a God-made man, that the poorest son of Adam dimly longs. Show him the way of doing that, the dullest day drudge kindles into a hero. They wrong man greatly, who say he is to be seduced by ease. Difficulty, abnegation, martyrdom, death are the allurements that act on the heart of man. Kindle the inner genial life of him. You have a flame that burns up all lower considerations. Not happiness, but something higher, One sees this even in the frivolous classes, with their point of honor and the like. Not by flattering our appetites, no, by awakening the heroic that slumbers in every heart, can any religion gain followers." End quote. So he's saying that people struggle on behalf of the heroic. If you wake up the heroic in people, that gets them fired up, not if you try to persuade them with ease. "They wrong men greatly who say he is to be seduced by ease," he writes. People want difficulty, they want struggle. And there is something in that. If you've ever spent a very lazy day doing nothing in particular, unless you've worked very hard recently and you really just wanted to rest that day, unless it was very deliberate, if you get to the end of the day, you are not nearly as happy as you would have been, or at least I'm not, I think most people wouldn't be, if you had done a bunch of tough work, gone on a 20-mile bike ride, built some raised beds for the garden. These are more satisfying than watching some stupid show or something. He writes, quote, "Enjoying things which are pleasant, that is not the evil. It is the reducing of our moral self to slavery by them, that is. Let a man assert withal that he is king over his habitudes, that he could and would shake them off, on cause shown. This is an excellent law," end quote. And here he's talking about the appetites. And he has a pretty reasonable position on this. He doesn't say you can't enjoy any pleasant things, but you can't be enslaved by them. That's what he says. You should be able to quit them whenever you want. And you have to be careful with that because you might be tricking yourself. You might say, "Oh, I don't really need the coffee." I don't think hardly anybody says that. But I don't really need whatever, this little luxury I have in my life. But what would happen if you got rid of it? And maybe your life would be better. If nothing else, it's possible you'd have more time than you would otherwise. But this is a fine starting point to at least examine the pleasures in your life and to see if you could drop them if you had to. And because we were looking at Dante a few weeks ago, I wanted to include this line of Carlyle's about Dante. And he has, of course, a big long section where he's talking all about Dante, but at one point he says, quote, "Dante is the spokesman of the Middle Ages. The thought they lived by stands here in everlasting music," end quote. And he writes of perception in general, quote, "To the poet, as to every other, we say first of all, see. If you cannot do that, it is of no use to keep stringing rhymes together, jingling sensibilities against each other, and name yourself a poet. There is no hope for you. If you can, there is, in prose or verse, in action or speculation, all manner of hope," end quote. So he says the first thing in poetry or prose, in action or speculation, the first thing is to be able to see. And if you can't do that, don't bother. But if you can, there's hope for you. So to try to be able to see. And of the mind in general, he writes, quote, "We talk of faculties as if they were distinct, things separable, as if a man had intellect, imagination, fancy, etc., as he has hands, feet, and arms. That is a capital error. Then again, we hear of a man's intellectual nature and of his moral nature, as if these things again were divisible and existed apart. Necessities of language do perhaps prescribe such forms of utterance. We must speak, I am aware, in that way, if we are to speak at all. But words ought not to harden into things for us. It seems to me, our apprehension of this matter is, for most part, radically falsified thereby. We ought to know withal, and to keep forever in mind, that these divisions are at bottom but names, that man's spiritual nature, the vital force which dwells in him, is essentially one and indivisible, that what we call imagination, fancy, understanding, and so forth, are but different figures of the same power of insight, all indissolubly connected with each other, physiognomically related, that if we knew one of them, we might know all of them. Morality itself, what we call the moral quality of a man, what is this but another side of the one vital force whereby he is and works? All that a man does is physiognomical of him. You may see how a man would fight by the way in which he sings. His courage, or want of courage, is visible in the word he utters, in the opinion he has formed, no less than in the stroke he strikes. He is one, and preaches the same self abroad in all these ways." End quote. So he goes first from talking about how we have these concepts in our heads about imagination and intellect and morality, and in fact, these are all one thing, that we need in language to talk about different aspects of people, but these are all the same. And then goes further and says that you can actually see this in a person, that this inner thing, this combination of all these different aspects of a person that we usually talk about, is also visible externally. in how they act, in how they speak. Now, this is an interesting thought, and it might require some more discussion or reflection, but I see two problems with it. One is that it's easy to imagine somebody, and we've all met them, who has high intellectual capability and very low sensitivity to the collective interest. We usually call that morality. They're not interested in the public good at all. So if intelligence and morality are somehow the same, if I understood Carlyle correctly, then we shouldn't be able to see these kinds of disparities. But it might work for certain aspects of the mind, or what we call the mind, better than others. So intelligence and morality might not work that well, but intelligence and imagination might work better. And it also might be true that on the whole, intelligent people tend to be more moral, even if there are exceptions to this. I don't know if that's true, but it might be true. And if that's true, that leaves a little more room for what Carlyle is talking about, that there is some single human energy that we describe in different ways, but we're really talking about the same thing. And there are patterns in which it sometimes can be very high or very intense or something, and then you have a smart person who also is thinking about the collective interest, and then you could have it lower in other people, or less intense or something, less concentrated, and you have people who are not very smart and also very selfish. But then there could be people where it's a little bit deformed somehow. This is all a little bit of metaphysical speculation, but it's an interesting thought. And the problem with the second part of what he's saying, of this being visible externally, and this is a relatively minor objection, there is such a thing as dissimulation. People can deceive you. They can appear to be a certain way deliberately so that you think about them differently or react to them differently or something. So that might also be that in general, what he's saying is true. Because it's also true that you can tell a lot about a person from how they act. You can tell if they're a nervous person in general or a relaxed person in general, even just by watching their body language. So there's definitely something there. It might take a little more exploration to really flesh that idea out. Carlyle writes, quote, "The Czar of all the Russias. He is strong with so many bayonets, Cossacks, and cannons, and does a great feat in keeping such a tract of earth politically together. But he cannot yet speak. Something great in him, but it is a dumb greatness. He has had no voice of genius, to be heard of all men and times. He must learn to speak. He is a great dumb monster hitherto. His cannons and Cossacks will all have rusted into nonentity, while that Dante's voice is still audible. The nation that has a Dante is bound together as no dumb Russia can be." End quote. And of course, there he's using dumb to mean somebody who cannot speak. He doesn't mean stupid. But the timing is interesting. He's writing in 1841, and by then, Gogol and Turgenev are starting to write in Russia. But all of the more famous writers, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov, are all writing after this. So Carlyle was saying this right before there's going to be a big cascade of Russian literature. But it's still interesting what he's saying, that a nation needs a voice. And it's interesting that this Russian state that had been politically powerful up to that point did not have much of a literary or poetic voice. Of course, Turgenev is great. We've looked at his Sportsman's Notebook on this podcast. We have Gogol coming up in a couple weeks, but Carlyle perhaps wasn't aware of them yet. Maybe they hadn't even been translated into English. Maybe he'd read them, he didn't like them. I don't know. But he's talking about the relationship between literature and the nation. Later, when he's talking about Martin Luther, he writes, quote, "I find Luther to have been a breaker of idols, no less than any other prophet. The wooden gods of the Quraysh, made of timber and beeswax, were not more hateful to Muhammad than Tetzel's pardons of sin, made of sheepskin and ink, were to Luther. It is the property of every hero, in every time, in every place and situation, that he come back to reality, that he stand upon things, and not shows of things, according as he loves and venerates, articulately or with deep speechless thought, the awful realities of things, however regular, decorous, accredited by Qurayshes or conclaves, be intolerable and detestable to him." Protestantism, too, is the work of a prophet, the prophet work of that 16th century. The first stroke of honest demolition to an ancient thing grown false and idolatrous, preparatory afar off to a new thing which shall be true and authentically divine. At first view it might seem as if Protestantism were entirely destructive to this that we call hero worship, and represent as the basis of all possible good, religious or social, for mankind. One often hears it said that Protestantism introduced a new era, radically different from any the world had ever seen before, the era of private judgment, as they call it. By this revolt against the Pope, every man became his own Pope, and learnt among other things that he must never trust any Pope or spiritual hero captain any more, whereby is not spiritual union, all hierarchy and subordination among men, henceforth an impossibility? So we hear it said. Now I need not deny that Protestantism was a revolt against spiritual sovereignties, popes, and much else. Nay, I will grant that English Puritanism, revolt against earthly sovereignties, was the second act of it, that the enormous French Revolution itself was the third act, whereby all sovereignties earthly and spiritual were, as might seem, abolished or made sure of abolition. Protestantism is the grand root from which our whole subsequent European history branches out. And skipping ahead, and now, sure enough, the cry is everywhere for liberty and equality, independence and so forth. Instead of kings, ballot boxes, and electoral suffrages, it seems made out that any hero sovereign, loyal obedience of men to a man, in things temporal or things spiritual, has passed away forever from the world. I should despair of the world altogether if so. One of my deepest convictions is that it is not so. Without sovereigns, true sovereigns, temporal and spiritual, I see nothing possible but an anarchy, the hatefulest of things. But I find Protestantism, whatever anarchic democracy it have produced, to be the beginning of new genuine sovereignty and order. I find it to be a revolt against false sovereigns, the painful but indispensable first preparative for true sovereigns getting place among us." End quote. Each one of these passages has a lot to talk about. But he's talking about Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, and he sees Luther as an idol breaker, as a prophet. And this is a reference, of course, to Abraham, who went into the temple and smashed the idols and said, "These aren't God, there's only one God." And Carlyle says that Luther did something similar in smashing the idol of the papacy, or trying to do so, or trying to smash its legitimacy. And he says that other historians or commentators have interpreted this event as a smashing of hierarchy in Europe, that you can't follow any popes anymore, you have to be your own pope, you can't follow any heroes. And Carlyle hopes that isn't the case and believes very deeply that it's not the case, because he thinks that without leadership there will just be anarchy. But he views Martin Luther not as somebody who smashes any kind of hierarchy, but sought to end a false hierarchy and clear the way for a new and better and truer or true one in the future. And I'm conflicted about this because it's easy to see how the Enlightenment grew out of the Reformation, that people said, well, if we could question that, we could question everything, and you have to justify something to yourself, and then you get this slogan like nullius in verba, on the word of no one, or take no one's word for it, which is the slogan or motto of the Royal Society in London. And that's how you get modern science, is you say, I have to see this for myself. I have to demonstrate it to myself. And if I can't see it, if it doesn't make sense to me, then I reject it. And that's a very important skeptic doctrine. It might be the only one. And at some level, the moment you start following other people epistemologically, if you're not immediately lost, if you're not immediately deceived, then you will be eventually, either because it's in their interest to deceive you or because they're mistaken. But that's a kind of epistemological anarchy. The trouble is that in a political system, in a political context, if you have anarchy, or even just the slight anarchy, the messy anarchy of democracy, if you are standing alone and saying, I'm not going to follow anybody unless they demonstrate themselves to me, then you will just be rolled over by blocks of people who don't have this scruple, who are just saying, yeah, we just follow this principle or this idea or this leader. This is our thing that we all are stuck together about. They will be much more powerful than you politically, and they'll just get what they want and you won't get anything. So there has to be a line drawn here between knowledge and politics and how you approach these two things. Carlyle writes, quote, "Let us remark, therefore, in the first place, that this of private judgment is at bottom not a new thing in the world, but only new at that epoch of the world. There is nothing generically new or peculiar in the Reformation. It was a return to truth and reality in opposition to falsehood and semblance, as all kinds of improvement in genuine teaching are and have been. Liberty of private judgment, if we will consider it, must at all times have existed in the world." End quote. There he's drawing the difference between the liberty of private judgment, which existed before and after the Reformation, and that wasn't what Martin Luther brought in, and the political disturbance that he provoked. And more about Luther, he writes, quote, Luther and his Protestantism is not responsible for wars. The false simulacra that forced him to protest, they are responsible. Luther did what every man that God has made has not only the right, but lies under the sacred duty to do. Answered a falsehood when it questioned him, Dost thou believe me? No. At what cost soever, without counting of costs, this thing behooved to be done. Union, organization spiritual and material, a far nobler than any popedom or feudalism in their truest days, I never doubt, is coming for the world, sure to come. But on fact alone, not on semblance and simulacrum, will it be able either to come or to stand when come. With union grounded on falsehood, and ordering us to speak and act lies, we will not have anything to do. Peace? A brutal lethargy is peaceable. The noisome grave is peaceable. We hope for a living peace, not a dead one. End quote. I think that one speaks for itself. Of writing, he says, quote, Certainly the art of writing is the most miraculous of all things man has devised. Odin's runes were the first form of the work of a hero. Books, written words, are still miraculous runes, the latest form. In books lies the soul of the whole past time, the articulate, audible voice of the past, when the body and material substance of it has altogether vanished like a dream. Mighty fleets and armies, harbors and arsenals, vast cities, high-domed, many-engined, they are precious, great, but what do they become? Agamemnon, the many Agamemnons, Pericleses, and their Greece, all is gone now to some ruined fragments, dumb, mournful wrecks and blocks. But the books of Greece, there Greece to every thinker still very literally lives, can be called up again into life. No magic rune is stranger than a book. All that mankind has done, thought, gained, or been, it is lying as in magic preservation in the pages of books. They are the chosen possession of men. Do not books still accomplish miracles, as runes were fabled to do? They persuade men. End quote. And speaking of a good man, Carlyle writes, quote, He will say, Take my money, since you can, and it is so desirable to you. Take it, and take yourself away with it, and leave me alone to my work here. I'm still here, can still work, after all the money you have taken from me. But if they come to him and say, Acknowledge a lie, pretend to say you are worshiping God when you are not doing it. Believe not the thing you find true, but the thing that I find, or pretend to find true. He will answer, No, by God's help, no. You may take my purse, but I cannot have my moral self annihilated. The purse is any highwayman's who might meet me with a loaded pistol, but the self is mine, and God my Maker's. It is not yours, and I will resist you to the death, and revolt against you, and, on the whole, front all manner of extremities, accusations, and confusions in defense of that. End quote. Those are the passages that I wanted to show you. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you'll go over to my website, valrathpublishing.com, and pick yourself up a copy of the edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that I printed. I have it at a good price, free shipping, original cover art, 97 footnotes that explain some of the more obscure cultural, historical, geographical references that Mary Shelley uses in some of the more unusual vocabulary words. The print quality is very good. I'm very pleased with how it came out. And Frankenstein might be more relevant today than it was when it was first written 200 years ago. It's also a very good book, both for somebody who hasn't read a lot of old books before. It's a good way to get started with old literature. And even if you're used to reading old literature, it's still, I think everybody should read it. It's not long, it's fast-paced. It has a lot of action, a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. If you haven't read it, you should get a copy for yourself. If you have, you should get it for a friend or a family member. It makes an excellent gift. Looks good on the bookshelf. I wanted to make an edition of Frankenstein that would be the one that I would keep, and I succeeded in doing that. My edition of Frankenstein that I have in my library is the one that I printed, and I'm very happy with it. So other than that, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you benefited from it. Farewell until next time. Take care, and happy reading.